Good afternoon. Thank you for being here and welcome everyone. My name is Mohammed Lashimi. I'm the President and Vice Chancellor of Toronto Metropolitan University. I would like to begin by thanking Minister Anand for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. I'm very delighted to be able to welcome you to our campus for, this is our second ever in-person democracy forum. Of course, we have many people that are still with us online. So virtually we have many more people. While I'm grateful that we are able to safely come together today, I know that this is not the reality in other parts of our globe. I understand this will be the focus of today's discussion, and I'm grateful that we are able to host such an important event on our campus. Ultimately, it's the role of universities to foster deeper understanding of important issues and to bring people together to learn from each other through dialogue. Today's event accomplishes that purpose. So thank you again for taking the time to join us, and I look forward to listening in today's discussion. And I would like to invite our Dean of the Faculty of Arts to start with land acknowledgement and some introduction. Over to you.
Thank you very much, President Lashmi. I'm Pam Sugerman, Dean of the Faculty of Arts at Toronto Metropolitan University, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to this 24th Democracy Forum. It's hard to believe it's 24 in the Faculty of Arts. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the land on which the university is situated. TMU is on the territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat, and it is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, Treaty 13, and the Williams Treaties. Now, like many others in the TMU community, I continue to reflect on the meaning of land acknowledgements, particularly in light of our reckoning with this university's own history of colonization, a history that exists not only in the past, but very much shapes the present day. As an academic leader and more personally as a settler, a Japanese-Canadian woman whose family was displaced, dispossessed, uprooted, and dispersed in this country, I am committed to deepening my understanding of Indigenous knowledge and culture, promoting Indigenous education, and most importantly, playing a role as an ally in creating the institutional conditions for Indigenous self-determination. Now, it is now my pleasure to introduce our host and founder of the Democracy Forum series, Toronto Star columnist and visiting practitioner in the Faculty of Arts, Martin Rag Khan. And I didn't stumble, maybe a little, I didn't stumble over Martin's name, which I've mispronounced in the past. Most of you are no doubt aware of Martin's important work, including his political column for the Toronto Star, as well as the many valuable contributions he's made over the course of his 11 years as a foreign correspondent. And during these years, he's held the position of Chief of the Middle East and Asia Bureaus. Martin is also a senior fellow at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. I look forward to a stimulating, very thought-provoking discussion. Martin, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Sugerman, and thank you, Dr. Lashmi. Bienvenue, welcome to our Democracy Forum at TMU, where we try to do democracy a little differently. It's good to be back in person today after so many Zoom events. It's good to breathe again, so thank you for joining us. Let me tell you about our guest. Anita Anand has been Canada's Minister of Defence for exactly 1 year this week. Before that, she was also Minister of Public Services and Procurement, defending us from another foreign invasion, this time COVID, by procuring, as she would say, millions of vaccines. She was sworn into cabinet after winning her first election as Member of Parliament for Oakville in 2019. She had a life before politics. She was an associate dean, which is good training for politics, and a professor at the U of T Faculty of Law. And she has also taught law at the Monk School, at Western, at Queen's, it's a long list, and at Yale University. She holds law degrees from U of T, from Oxford, and my personal favorite, Dalhousie University, because I went there too. She started with a BA in politics from Queen's, and now politics is where she has ended up. She was born in Nova Scotia, the daughter of 2 doctors, and a historical footnote, she is the first Hindu ever appointed to the federal cabinet. Welcome to our Democracy Forum. I'm going to kick things off, and then I'll sit down. We'll open it up to the floor in a few minutes, so please start thinking up your questions now. I always remind our audience that this is not a press conference or a confrontation. It's a democracy forum where we try to dig a little deeper and we look for more in-depth answers. So no pressure, but we're looking for some insights today. So let's get started. I'm going to slide over. Minister, you've been busy in Poland last week on the front lines in Brussels for a NATO conference. Tell us, since this is a democracy forum, what's the fight in Ukraine really about? Is it about defending Ukrainian territory, Ukrainian democracy, democracy beyond Ukraine's borders? How does it all fit in?
So, since the further invasion of Ukraine by Russia on February 24th, the NATO allies have been united in standing against Russian illegal and unjustifiable aggression by form of an invasion, but also in defense of the rules-based international order, which has kept us all safe since the end of the Second World War. So it is, to answer your question, it is a fight for against Russian aggression, in support of Ukrainian sovereignty, but also in support of the territorial integrity and the rules-based international order that underpins that territorial integrity of Ukraine.
Where does democracy fit in, if at all?
The illegal and unjustifiable invasion of a democratic country is where it starts. Democracy fits in very squarely there. But the conflict also sheds light on the threat that democracy is under internationally, especially as we see Russia annex eastern regions of Ukraine, as we see the threat of nuclear war elevating because of reckless words coming out of the Russian regime and Putin himself. That suggests that we all have a role to play in furthering the principles of democracy, including here at home.
Okay, because it's a tricky concept of are we fighting for democracy or territorial integrity, and sometimes the two overlap. But I'm thinking about how bound up we were in the idea of promoting democracy in Afghanistan, the last major war that Canadian troops were involved in, and that didn't turn out so well. So are there any lessons to be learned about mixing in democracy and territorial integrity?
So I want to take a step back, as we should do when we're dealing with complex concepts such as democracy.
Yep.
And democracy, obviously, at its fundamental root, speaks to freedom to associate, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the ability for citizens to exercise those freedoms within the limits of the law. And that set of principles is generally enshrined in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms of this country, but it is also present in our foreign policy. And so we very much aim to support those principles where they are under threat. areas of the world, including in Ukraine, Afghanistan, etc.
Okay, let's talk about shared interests then. Canada was the first country to recognize, to extend diplomatic recognition to Ukraine under a previous government. It was quick to endorse and support Finland and Sweden when they applied for NATO entry. You can see where I'm going. President Zelensky has asked, implored, has sought expedited NATO membership. Why don't we rally to that one as we have on the previous cases?
Canada is a member of NATO and as such supports NATO's open door policy. And that is the route we took with both Sweden and Finland this year, as you mentioned. And we have stood shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine in terms of humanitarian, military, and economic aid. And we will continue to do so while complying and adhering with the principles underpinning the NATO alliance.
Okay, but why the caution? I mean, it may be obvious. The Americans have been much more measured in their response, and you've been to the Pentagon and heard that yourself. So what's the downside, given that all that has happened? There was caution before. What's the downside, given all that has happened, to giving Ukraine more of a flashing green instead of a flashing amber?
The time that we are in right now is the time that we need to unite to provide Ukraine with military equipment that it needs to fight and win this war. There will be a conversation about Ukraine's potential ascension to NATO, but that conversation must occur once we have given everything we can to Ukraine's fight right now.
Okay, let's park the arms question for just a moment, because you mentioned the nuclear threat. And in the months since we had your colleague, the Foreign Minister Melanie Joly, here, the nuclear threat is more pronounced than ever, more explicit than ever. So at a democracy forum here, tell us about the calculus, the balancing act that you and your government have to make when dealing with essentially a threat of nuclear blackmail that may or may not be a bluff, and the responsibility you have to avoid escalation, whether in terms of getting more involved in the war, whether with NATO ascension. So the nuclear threat, how do you as a defense minister balance that question?
Well, I want to begin by saying that the words of Vladimir Putin relating to nuclear threat or weaponizing energy for that matter are reckless and unwarranted and unnecessary. And Canada wholly condemns that elevation. At the same time, we have to recognize that those words have not changed the conduct of Russian behavior. And in the final instance, we will continue to be vigilant as an alliance and as a country in terms of every action that we take and we support vis-a-vis Ukraine. But I will say that we need to be prudent around conversations relating to nuclear. It's a very fine balance when we get to discussing and utilizing the threat of nuclear war.
Okay, let's talk about the non-nuclear components so far. Russia's latest wave of attacks with drones targeting, these Iranian drones targeting civilians and non-military targets. It's not new, but it has escalated to a new level in recent weeks. And that prompted the president of Ukraine to ask many countries, including Canada, for missile defenses. And it turns out we don't really have any that we can send over. So the question of Canada's contribution has become controversial. I heard you on BBC last week. They interviewed you while you were at NATO or right after the meetings. And they were really pointing to what they described, they compared Canada's contribution to that of Britain, France, the US, but also the Baltic countries, whether in absolute terms or per capita. And they suggested that we aren't going far enough. And I think there was a bit of a dismissiveness about how we're sending wool uniforms for winter, which, by the way, is important in winter, but we're sending more than uniforms. I know you're going to have a list: howitzers, Hercules planes, engineers. There's a lot in the mix. But is there just a perception gap, or is there a gap between our promise and what we've delivered that you think we can do better at?
Well, Martin, I really appreciate the question and the way it's framed, because I agree with you, and I would very much like to tell you what I'm hearing on the ground vis-a-vis Canada's contribution. Alexei Reznikov, the Defense Minister of Ukraine, continually refers to Canada as a leader in terms of military aid and training of Ukrainian soldiers. We've trained over 33,000 Ukrainian soldiers on the tools they need to fight and win this war. The Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, has repeatedly referred to Canada as a leader in terms of aid to Ukraine, referring not only to training but also to military equipment. And so it's not, those aren't my words, those are the words of people at the center of this conflict. And I will add to that Canada has put on the table over $600 million of military aid, some of which you listed. But I want to tell you about the process by which we come to determine what aid we are sending. And that process is a direct conversation between Minister Reznikov, Ukraine's defense minister, and me. And he calls me, or we meet face to face, as we did last week, and he sits before me and tells me what specifically Ukraine needs. He asked for winter clothing. We are delivering 500,000 pieces of winter clothing. He asked for howitzers. We put howitzers on the table. He asked for ammunition. Twice now we have put on the table 155 millimeter ammunition. He asked for vehicles. We have provided vehicles from 2 different Canadian suppliers, 8 vehicles from Rochelle and 39 vehicles from GDLS in London, Ontario, straight off the line. And so the conversation is frank, it is open, and it's direct. And I will say, in my mind, effective. And I'll just give you a little anecdote of my meeting with Minister Reznikov last week at NATO. So the meetings are very tightly scheduled because of the number of countries there and how many people want to meet with each other. But he and I both knew that we needed to speak with each other, and we met in the room after the contact group meeting that Lloyd Austin gets together before our NATO meetings often. And I was waiting in the room, and he ran in, he hugged me, and he presented me with a gift of 2 T-shirts that somehow, while his country is in the middle of a war, fighting for their sovereignty and stability, he managed to remember to bring me a gift that he wanted me to.
What do the T-shirts say?
They're made by Ukrainian suppliers, and they are essentially in support of Ukraine's fight for their life.
Okay. So sending winter clothing, given what's ahead. There is going to be a brutal winter, and Russian-Ukrainian winters are how wars are decided. So that is not a laughing matter. It may be that this narrative has also been wound up with the slow reaction that Canada seemed to have at the beginning, when we were fussing and debating and dithering about lethal weapons versus non-lethal weapons. Before the conflict really erupted again in February. So if you had a do-over, would you do it differently or the same in terms of the way you staged that launch of transfers? The training took a long time. That was an investment we made long ago. The deployment to the Baltics, that was ahead of the curve. It's since increased. But the discussion about non-lethal weapons, given what has unfolded, was that a mistake?
Well, I don't fully agree with your characterization of what happened before the conflict, simply because we were able to get lethal aid over to Ukraine before the conflict began. And so we will continue to send shipments of aid to Ukraine in support of their effort. But I want to say at a deeper level, we have...
Hello. Thank you for expressing yourself at our Democracy Forum. You've had a chance now to put the sign up. We're here to ask questions, so I hope you're going to just let us carry on and not block the view of people. So thank you for coming.
Could I see your sign, please? Yeah. Trudeau,
Okay.
Well, thank you for sharing that with me. I want to say that the aid that we have sent to Ukraine is the aid that is in support of democracy and sovereignty and the rules-based international order, that same order that has kept you, everyone in this room, and our country and countries safe since the end of the Second World War.
Is Ukraine really a democracy? They've outlawed political parties.
So you know what? There's going to be a question period, so give us a few more minutes, and you're welcome to ask your question. So stand by, and I will come to you. And if you don't mind, have a seat, and then you can ask a question too, if you like. But I think you've had a couple minutes now. If you don't mind, you can either listen, or you can leave us, or you can set up your own Democracy Forum and invite people to come. Okay, I guess that's a no. Thanks. Okay, let's carry on. Folks, that's show business, but democracy is a serious business, and we're here to listen and let people talk and ask questions and listen to the answers. So I'm going to carry on and ignore that distraction because the show must go on. So we may have lost your train, but I'm going to ask you about I actually lost my train. I'm only so good at multitasking. Bear with me. Oh, so let's drill down on capabilities. We talked about what you've given.
I
to
actually
Ukraine.
was in the middle of saying something, so maybe I'll
Yeah.
continue
Yeah.
with what I was actually saying. And what I was saying is that Canada has supplied the $600 million or so of military aid, and it hasn't just been aid from the inventory of the Canadian Armed Forces. What we have been doing is partnering with industry, and in particular GDLS in London, L3 Harris in Hamilton, Ontario, and Rochelle in Mississauga. And what that means and signifies is that industry has a role to play in this fight. And in particular, I've met with industry, and they are able and willing to recognize not only the operational imperative of assisting Canada and the Canadian government, but also the moral imperative of doing so. And I want to thank the participation of industry in terms of making sure we get aid to Ukraine as soon as possible.
Okay. I'm going to say, by the way, you're actually also blocking our shot. So for people who are actually trying to listen to this on television or on YouTube or on star.com where it's streaming, if you don't mind, perhaps you could move over so that you're not actually just trying to shut us down. Thank you. Okay, so let's drill down on Canadian capabilities or the lack of them. Every defense minister, since I was a young political reporter, has been asked about defense spending. The peace dividend that people hope for appears to now be receding into the past. Canada ranks, I believe, 24th. I'm sure you're on top of the numbers, so if I'm wrong, correct me. 24th out of the 29 members in NATO in defense, in terms of our percentage. We're at 1.4% of GDP for defense, and the target should be 2%. So my question is, how do you persuade voters and your fellow politicians in Parliament, in Cabinet, that Canada needs to spend more given the current state of affairs?
I actually look at a few other things in addition to the items that you mentioned, Martin. One of them being that Canada is the 6th largest defense spender amongst the NATO countries. So the statistic that you mentioned takes a percentage of GDP.
Yep.
many of the countries ahead of Canada have a smaller GDP. Therefore, they are able to reach the 2% target more quickly
They have a
than
lower
Canada.
denominator, correct.
Exactly. And so I also like to look at the total number of dollars spent on defense, and Canada is the 6th largest defense budget.
Do you believe it's important to spend more? And if so, how do you persuade people that they have to?
I just want to add one more important point before I get to that question, and that is in terms of boots on the ground. Canada has a very large presence in NATO by leading the Enhanced Forward Presence Battle Group in Latvia, which we have done for 5 years and will continue. We are elevating that with our allies to brigade level. We have 3,000 troops or so at the ready in case they are called up by NATO. And we are seen as a leader at NATO by Jens Stoltenberg and others. So it's important to look at the tangible contribution that Canada makes as well as our overall defense spending. I will say that in terms of voters and your question relating how you convince voters, it's important to recognize that we are on an upward trajectory in terms of our defense spending. Our government committed $8 billion for military spending in the last federal budget, for example. We have a defense policy update that is coming up in the fall, and we will continue to ensure that we are doing what it takes to protect this country and participate in our allied membership called NATO. And the last point is that in June...
Can you actually move down? Because in terms of personal space, you're getting a little close to the minister, and that's just push away.
I'm going to take a break, Martin.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Stand by, folks, and we'll take a little break. Mics are back on? Yes. All right. Thank you for coming back.
Oh, no problem. That's democracy.
Well, it's a form of democracy, but we're here to listen, to hear each other out.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Did you want to finish an answer, or should we move on to the next question?
I'm fine to move on,
Okay.
whatever works for you.
I am going to shift gears slightly before we open it up to the floor in the time that we have left. Here's a question that was sent to me in advance by Tracy Rainey, who is a political scientist here at TMU who I often work with. Couldn't be here, but really wanted me to ask you this. Committed to ensuring sexual misconduct and discrimination are eradicated within the Canadian military. Where are you at in this process? What permanent changes can we expect to address the sexist culture embedded in the Canadian Armed Forces? Just a bit of background for our audience. Before you were dealing with the external threat in Europe, you were dealing with an internal conflict in the armed forces where sexual misconduct sometimes continued with impunity, and it went up through the chain of command. And you were, I think one of the reasons you were brought into the job was your background in governance, and you are familiar with the law. So where are you at in the process?
Well, immediately upon being appointed as Minister of National Defense, I accepted the interim recommendation of Madame Arbour to transfer cases relating to sexual misconduct or sexual harassment in the Canadian military from the military justice system to the civilian justice system. And that transfer of cases is still ongoing. But the effect of that is to ensure that victims are able to benefit from the procedural protections that they can receive in the civilian justice system. In addition to that, we ensured the passage and implementation of Bill C-77 relating to victims' rights earlier this year, and that will also provide additional protections to women in cases of sexual misconduct and sexual harassment. In addition to that, our government committed millions of dollars, $200 million in fact, in 2021 to the Sexual Misconduct Response Center. That is to ensure that we have additional supports for women who are suffering from the issues relating to misconduct and sexual harassment in the military. Again, in this year's budget, we have resources to ensure that the Canadian Armed Forces is a place where everyone who serves is safe and protected and respected when they are serving this country. And it is my top priority to ensure that this cultural transformation occurs in the Canadian Armed Forces. I've traveled across this country to talk to members of our forces, Esquimalt, Edmonton, Valcartier, Sherbrooke, and also Shearwater. And I'll just say that there is a willingness for change in the Canadian Armed Forces. And the head of the military, the Chief of Defence Staff, Wayne Eyre, and I work very closely together on this very issue. We welcomed Madame Arbour's final report in May, and we are working towards implementing her recommendations.
Madame Arbour, a former Supreme Court Justice who cataloged the problems of the military police reporting to the chain of command about sometimes senior commanders involved in sexual misconduct. Now, you've laid out a process. As you know, just a couple of weeks ago, Ontario Police Chief said the process wasn't working yet. So how do you, they were concerned the resources aren't there to transfer these prosecutions across the country, not just in Ontario. Police Chief in Mississauga, in Peel, I should say, among them. I'm sure he's given you an earful. So how do you execute this? How do you make this work?
Actually, it's working very well. We're working collaboratively with the provinces and various organizations. The RCMP, for example, Quebec Police are taking these cases very willingly, and we have now set up a provincial federal table so that we can systematize the transfer of cases. So as I said, it's working well.
Okay. You mentioned the commander of the armed forces a moment ago. The other thing he said the other day was that you are short 10,000 personnel in the armed forces. The segue from the last question is, how do you recruit young men and young women when the Army now and the Navy, the Air Force are now weighed down by this baggage and this bad reputation? How do you do both of those things? Improve the culture, change the culture, and persuade people that there's a career for them in the armed forces?
Well, it's a very good question, but I will say that the shortage of personnel in the Canadian Armed Forces is indicative of labor shortages across the country, especially following COVID-19. And so there is rebuilding to do in the Canadian Armed Forces, and that's why we are doing things like developing a reconstitution and retention strategy, which we have announced. That is why we are maximizing personnel at our recruitment centers across the country and in our training centers. We are also shortening the basic training component so as to provide incentives for individuals to join. And then in the long term, as I mentioned, we are taking institutional reforms extremely seriously so that the Canadian Armed Forces becomes a place that welcomes everybody, regardless of the color of their skin or their gender, and will continue to implement reforms such as relating to clothing or hair that like we have done recently, so that there is a sense that if you come to the Canadian Armed Forces, it will be a place where you are not suffering from discrimination. And I believe that strongly. I think you're right. That is one of the reasons why the Prime Minister wanted me to take over this role. And I will continue as a racialized woman myself to lead this change together with the Chief of Defence Staff.
And you and the Prime Minister, I think, apologized to Black Canadians for a history of discrimination a few months ago.
Well, the first apology that I gave was on December 13th, 2021, where we, the Chief of Defence Staff and the Deputy Minister and I apologized to survivors and victims of sexual assault and sexual misconduct. And then on July 9th of this year, I and the Prime Minister apologized to the members of the No. 2 Construction Battalion and their families. And that was a battalion from the First World War that built trenches and assisted with infrastructure, but were discriminated against in terms of joining the forces, and very much deserve that apology. But that's the type of step we are trying to take to build an institution where people feel safe, protected, and most of all, respected in their lines of work.
Okay, let's open it up to the floor. If you have a question, raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you. We will hold the microphone for you, so don't grab it. That's my friendly way of saying please don't make a speech, just ask a question and return the microphone. Shorter is smarter. Okay, I promised you a short question, so the floor is yours.
Right, with or without a microphone, I think you can hear me.
Yes.
My question is about peace negotiations and Minsk II. There was a framework for coexistence that was negotiated by the parties. France, Germany, Ukraine, Russia were among them some 8 years ago. And Minsk II provided that the Russian-speaking southeast of Ukraine would remain in Ukraine as provinces, like the Canadian Federation, and that NATO would not expand its borders and its membership to the Russian border, and would not place nuclear missiles on the Russian border. The U.S. had an answer to this question when Cuba allowed the Soviet Union to establish missiles.
I'm going to compress the question. So it's a fair question. The Minsk agreement, and you gave a good analogy. It's almost like an asymmetrical or federal arrangement.
Yes.
It's a bit. There's been a war since then, but let's let the minister answer.
Sorry, I haven't heard the question
Why
yet.
not pursue peace at the negotiating table instead of fanning the flames of a conflagration that could end human civilization?
Okay, question over to you.
Thank you for the question. And I think it's an important one to recognize that the Minsk agreements were in place. And the reality is that they were completely unobserved by Russia in its further invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, and also Minsk in Belarus, also working very closely with Russia in terms of allowing its military and bombs to operate out of that territory. So the reality is the agreements are being completely unobserved, and it requires and Ukraine requires some defense of its sovereign territory from the attempt to annex it illegally, unjustifiably, and contrary to international law.
You're ignoring 8 years.
Okay, next question. I see right behind you. Sir, thank you. I promised I'd give you a question, and thank you. So I see right behind you, I see Boris Wisniewski, a former member of parliament, and also active in the Ukrainian World Congress, who has been offered a microphone but can also use a booming voice. Go ahead. And Boris, you did ask a wonderful question when the foreign minister was here, but it was also a bit of a speech, so time is short. Over to you.
Thank you. And let me just start off by saying thank you, Minister, for all of your service. I'd like to follow up on a line of questioning that Martin had. It's not just in the media, but in the Ukrainian-Canadian community, there's a consensus that's gelled that although the government talks of standing shoulder to shoulder with the people of Ukraine, the government's stated policy of aligning with our allies has put us at the back of the line with Germany. In fact, by GDP, amongst democratic countries, we've fallen into number 20. In June, by unanimous consent, all members of parliament agreed that what Putin is engaged in Ukraine is a genocidal war, and taking into account his stated intent, the eradication of a democratic state of 44 million, but also the eradication of the Ukrainian people. Ukraine has stated they need arms to be able to fight against this genocidal war. You mentioned howitzers. It's good to hear that that's back on the table. We have 39 M777s. We sent 37, sorry, we sent 4, 33 are gathering dust. Are those back on the table to be sent to Ukraine? We have 80 labs, coyotes, that the department has said they need 220 days to be refurbished fully, et cetera. We're at day 240 of the war. Will we put those on the table? This war will not end soon. That's become clear. And once again, thank you so much for your service.
Thank you, Boris. I want to be clear, as I thought I was, that the way we isolate what aid we are sending to Ukraine is through the direct ask from Minister Resnikov to me and President Zelensky to our Prime Minister. And so that set of aid that I talked about, the $600 million, the vehicles, the cameras for drones, the winter clothing, the howitzers, the 155 ammunition, the sniper rifles, the list goes on, and all of that results from the direct conversation with Minister Resnikov, who has not asked for the coyotes, and primarily because they're in very decrepit shape, and we want to give Ukraine brand new vehicles, and that is why we contracted with GDLS to provide 39 brand new vehicles, armored vehicles, from right off the line. My conversation with Minister Resnikov is ongoing. I had another one last week, as I mentioned, and we are continuing to source the aid that he is requesting. When I have more particulars about that and can discuss them publicly, I will love to sit down with you and explain it more.
Clearly, procurement, either in your past position or in your current position, is going to be front and center going forward. Any other questions? Right here. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you for supporting Ukrainian, and I believe supporting Ukraine means supporting democracy around the globe and human rights. What I see, some facts in the region. I was born there, I have lots of friends, and I get a lot of facts, daily basis. We know Putin is not representing Russia if there is a referendum, like here, if it's an election, free election. So when I talk Putin, you may take it Russia. I don't like to talk this way, because dictators never represent the people. So Putin and allied, most of them, I have the fact they are dictators, most of them. I don't say all. I'm a mathematician. So Islamic Republic, the closest, is the big supporter, is a regime, it's not against people. It's a regime in support of Putin. And I have some fact that some weapon that is sent from Iran, Islamic Republic, sorry, it's not Iran, Islamic Republic of Iran, in support of Putin, is used in Ukraine against human rights, against people. It's manufactured in Islamic Republic of Iran. The core of those weapons is manufactured in Bombardier, the engine of those flying weapons. So how can I don't cry?
Okay.
Strategically, we are in favor of Ukraine, but by tactic, that I believe you are more in tactic than the strategy, something I cannot believe.
So the question is, are Bombardier components are in those drones from Iran?
I actually need to follow up on that question, and I will do so with my Chief of Defense Staff.
Okay. We're actually short of time because we lost a lot of time. There are two questions that I need to get in to circle back to before the minister has to leave, and if there's still time, we will open it again to the floor. We've talked a lot about global security today, and ironically, I want to ask you a question about personal security today. We all saw the Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, your cabinet colleague, accosted by a pretty hostile protester in Alberta last month. And I think that caused a lot of people to take note. I've been watching politicians and security for years. It was a pretty jarring event. What went through your mind, and what was the discussion among other colleagues? And we can see security here today for you. No one likes to talk about personal security, but it's kind of out there now. So what went through your mind at the time?
Well, upon seeing the video, immediately got in touch with her to tell her that I am here for any support if she needed. And I, of course, was very concerned for her safety. She's a dear colleague, and I respect her immensely. On the broader question of the security of politicians, I think it is definitely a conversation that we need to have, but it's important to recognize that we do live in the democracy where free speech is a hallmark of our democracy and should be respected. But there is also a boundary between free speech and security and safety of individuals who are elected to public office and are fulfilling their jobs as elected representatives. And I feel strongly that we need to have that conversation and hopefully come to a result and a place where we feel that we're able to serve in a safe and secure environment.
When you're in public life, when someone invades your space, do you think the public gets that, understands the difference between personal space and space to have a debate?
I'm not sure. I only came into public life 3 years ago. I was a professor for 25 years, and I never had an incident like Minister Freeland experienced, and I have had some of those experiences myself. I'll just say that I value so much the democracy that we live in and the principles on which democracy are based, including free speech and freedom of the press, that we do need to strive to protect those, as well as the legal boundaries that have been set by the Parliament of Canada and provincial legislatures.
There is a line. I always save the best question for last with you and other guests, and that is, tell us about any advice that you would have for students or professors who need to get or want to get engaged in democracy and perhaps join in the democratic process, climbing the greasy flagpole, as Disraeli once said centuries ago, because it's hard, it's messy, it's a blood sport at times, and we were talking about that in the green room beforehand. So what advice do you have, and what lessons did you yourself learn, because you can be a role model for people, about the transition from civilian life to public life?
So I'll just give you a little sense of what was going through my mind before I made the transition. And first and foremost, I love educational institutions, and I loved my life as a professor, and teaching hundreds and hundreds of students over the years has been the honor of a lifetime. Like many professors, I was writing public policy pieces, and I came to realize that I had more to offer potentially to our country. And so after many discussions, decided that I would throw my hat in the ring. I also believe that our institutions, our universities, our hospitals, our public and private corporations, and our government should reflect the racial diversity that comprises this country. And I thought that I may be able to add something to the demographic composition of the Parliament of Canada as well. And so that was another motivator for me. So to anyone thinking of entering public life, I will say that it is an honor, and it is one that I value very, very deeply. And every day, do my very best for this country.
Okay, well, we are out of time, unfortunately, because we did lose a bit of time. I want to thank the Minister of Defense for defending democracy. That's a lot. That's a loud. Usually people wait till I say thank you, but this time you got the crowd jumped the gun. Okay, I'm just going to thank the Minister of Defense for defending democracy and for defending herself at the Democracy Forum. Merci, Megwech, and we hope to see you again at TMU. Thank you, everyone.